Philosophy number 4, continuing my series on intellectual virtue. This is T. Ryan Byerly in his book, Introducing Logic and Critical Thinking, the Skills of Reasoning and the Virtues of Inquiry from 2017. Wanted to share some quotes. When a person fails in these ways, not caring about the truth, not believing what is warranted, attending only selectively to relevant evidence, he fails in a particularly bad way. He fails as an inquirer. That's page 151. Page 152, these virtues, intellectual virtues, are united in being conceived of as habits or dispositions of inquiry that orient us toward achieving good intellectual ends. They are, we might say, excellent ways of being good for intellectual goals such as obtaining true beliefs, believing responsibly, and achieving knowledge and understanding. Intellectual virtues are traits that make persons and their communities good at accomplishing these valuable intellectual goals. They are stable features of our character that help us to carry out the task of inquiry with excellence. It is a basic assumption of Part 2 that these intellectual virtues can be acquired and strengthened. Those who don't have them can gain them through practice, and those who have them to some degree can have them in greater measure. So, it sounds like virtues are, number 1, stable features of our character. Number 2, dispositions, which I take to be a specific kind of feature of a person's character. A disposition is a tendency to behave, react, or to take on a certain attitude given a particular context. And so, virtues are stable dispositions. Now, a thought that occurs to me just now is that you might say that dispositions, by definition, are stable because if this feature is not stable, then it's not going to be a disposition. So you might just say virtues are a kind of disposition. And this leads to the next question of what exactly a disposition is. In that quote, he mentions habits or dispositions. If we think of dispositions as habits or tendencies, we might say an angry person is a person who tends to behave angrily, to react with anger, or to become angry given certain contexts. So disposition is basically synonymous with habit or tendency. An angry person has a habit of behaving angrily, but the word habit may not be the best word, as it evokes the idea of bad habits versus good habits, which are frequent behaviors built up through repeated action, like the habit of brushing your teeth after every meal or turning on the coffee machine every morning. But a person with a disposition might not have a habit in that sense of a frequent or common behavior. If someone has a habit of being generous, it sounds like they are often generous, or generous in a regular kind of way. But someone could be disposed toward generosity and yet never be generous because they lack the funds. This could be clarified by a habit or tendency given certain circumstances. A generous person has the habit or tendency of being generous given that they have enough money. So the word habit still doesn't quite sound right to me, as it evokes this idea of a subconscious reflex, like a muscle memory, or a regular practice. But when a person decides to be generous, it may not be like muscle memory at all, but quite conscious and deliberate, but still evidence that this person has a disposition for being generous. And you might want to say that a generous person is disposed to give even when they don't have enough money. After all, when a poor person gives, isn't that much more meaningful, more indicative of the heart? And the story of Jesus and the widow's offering comes to mind here. But I think common sense would say that it's not prudent to give when doing so places yourself in a position of needing aid yourself, unless you have good reason for making that kind of sacrifice. So giving when you cannot afford it is not necessarily virtuous. It's undeniable that there are many wealthy people who could easily afford to give a much larger percentage of their income or wealth and still live a highly comfortable life, but they refuse to do this, perhaps because A, they don't want to empower people they look down upon. B, they believe that, quote unquote, the poors don't deserve the money and don't want to express or be seen expressing any sense of valuing someone that they or others deem lesser. And C, they want to maximize the power differential between them and everyone else. So, generous to me evokes the idea of a person who refuses to be greedy and hateful in these ways and gives when they aren't forced to, giving out of a genuine love of others and desire to help them. So, giving only to the degree that it doesn't change your standard of living is not necessarily greedy. Setting generosity aside and taking another example, it makes sense to say that someone would save people from a burning building had they the power to do so and were in the right place at the right time. Disposed is like poised in this way, and dispositions answer modal questions about what a person would do, or would very likely do, or how they would react, or what attitude they would take under certain circumstances. It might be tempting to say that a person who is merely disposed to be brave and yet never gets the opportunity to be brave can't be a brave person. A brave person is someone who, in fact, acts bravely. But the problem in that case is that there is no evidence that this person is a brave person. So when we describe someone as brave, we are describing them as evidently brave. In short, dispositions do not seem to me to be the same as habits or tendencies, and a person can be virtuous without opportunity, but there will be no evidence of that virtue without that opportunity. So for me, that helps clarify the meaning of disposition. Being disposed is like being poised to do something, where a person will behave according to that disposition given the opportunity. So criterion 1 of virtue was that virtues are stable features of our character. And then criterion 2 says that that feature is a disposition. So we can collapse those two and just say that virtues are stable dispositions. It seems to me that dispositions are by definition stable. And so virtues are dispositions. And then number 3 is that virtues orient us toward achieving good goals. And more specific kinds of virtues will specify that goal. Intellectual virtues orient us toward achieving good goals related to the truth, the goal of maximizing one's true beliefs, minimizing one's false beliefs, and increasing one's knowledge and understanding. Whereas a moral virtue would be more something like a more general category of maximizing goodness. And so that would seem to entail then that intellectual virtues are subordinate to virtues more generally, which means basically that what makes intellectual virtues is that they ultimately further the goal of maximizing goodness as a whole. In other words, what makes maximizing one's true beliefs good is that it maximizes some kind of intrinsic good later down the line. Now, that gets into the topic of the nature of intrinsic goods, which is, again, for another future series. So, in a nutshell, virtues are dispositions that orient us toward achieving good goals. And then I had 5 notes here. Number 1, when I get to Aristotle, I will discuss the relationship between virtue and emotion. While in this post I defined the disposition in terms of behavior, reaction, or attitude, it may be more accurate to define the disposition purely in terms of emotion, with emotions leading to actions. Number 2, the language here of orient us, that virtues orient us toward achieving good goals, is consequentialist. So virtues result in good consequences. They enable us and indeed cause us to achieve good goals. Number 3, good goals refers to goals relating to maximizing flourishing, maximizing eudaimonia, or more simply, maximizing goodness. Number 4, someone might be good at something like robbing banks, but you might think that robbing banks is itself not good. In a similar way, someone could be good at maximizing true but irrelevant beliefs. Is this person really intellectually virtuous? No, because it's a part of being good at seeing the truth to see which truths are more important than others. And if virtues orient us toward achieving good goals, and only relevant truths do this, then only maximizing one's relevantly true beliefs will be virtuous. So good intellectual goals are subordinate. Okay, yeah, so this is the point that I kind of just made. So good intellectual goals are subordinate to the more fundamental goal of maximizing goodness and are good because they are necessary for the more fundamental goal of maximizing goodness. Number 5, we might also want to touch, or we might want our definition of virtue to touch on the relationship between virtue and wisdom, vice, and the golden mean. And so here's kind of a rough, maybe sketch of how this could look. So the golden mean is any balance between two extremes. And a virtue is a kind of golden mean, an example of a golden mean, as it is a balance between two vices. And wisdom is a particular mental power, which is the power to discern what is and what is not virtuous. So to discern where that balance lies. And then virtues, of course, are dispositions that orient us toward achieving good goals. A virtuous person is therefore disposed to have, if we end up going with kind of a more emotional definition, emotion-based definition, a virtuous person is disposed to have an emotional reaction that strikes a balance between two extremes of lack or excess. So vices are dispositions that fail to orient us toward achieving good goals, with a vicious person being disposed to have an emotional reaction that is either too deficient or too extreme. This next quote is on skills versus virtues. So this is page 1. There are various ways to distinguish between skills on the one hand and virtues on the other, but perhaps the most important difference between the two is the following. A person is not deficient as a person for lacking any particular skills, but a person is deficient as a person for lacking virtues, including intellectual ones. End quote. So when it comes to the discussion between skills and virtues, now that we kind of have this at least working definition of virtue as a disposition that orients us toward good goals and perhaps has this emotional component to it as well, skills will not necessarily include that orientation. Having certain skills will not necessarily by themselves orient us toward good goals and will not necessarily orient us toward having the right emotional reaction between two extremes of a lack of the appropriate feeling or excess of the appropriate feeling. So one thing I noted is that many skills don't speak to a person's empathy or understanding of the goodness of the flourishing of others, while virtues do. And so there can be this moral distinction between skill and virtue. But I want to return to this idea of, so going to the quote again, perhaps the most important difference between the two is the following. A person is not deficient as a person for lacking any particular skills, but a person is deficient as a person for lacking virtues, including intellectual ones. I would push back against that idea. So Byerly goes on to give the example that lacking in basketball skills makes you deficient as a basketball player, but not as a person. But I think this kind of specification must be carried through in all contexts. Being deficient as a person is too vague and doesn't really mean much, whereas being deficient as a reasoner or as a decision maker or as a flourishing maximizer or as an empathizer, that makes more sense to me, adding that kind of more specific quality to it. A person's ability to reason or to make decisions or to maximize flourishing is largely dependent on their intelligence, which is something beyond their control. And so one's reasoning abilities, decision-making abilities, empathy, and abilities with respect to maximizing flourishing are likewise beyond one's control. And so they do not reflect in any meaningful way the quality of the person, but rather the quality of what the person happens to have. In the same way that basketball skills are something a person has but is not identical to, so too are virtues something a person has but is not identical to. Yeah, so that's some kind of pushback against the idea that lacking in virtue makes you deficient as a person. I would kind of disagree with that, but I think that lacking in virtues could make you deficient as a reasoner or a decision maker or a flourishing maximizer or something like that in some more specific sense. But in the case of skills and virtues, it seems like this is a difference between the two that Byerly's trying to draw, but I would say that this is actually not a difference, which is what a person happens to have, right? So if you have a skill, then you just happen to have that skill. And you are not identical to that skill. And same thing with virtue. You happen to have certain virtues, but you are not identical to your virtues. And so your virtues, either the lack of which or the presence of which, it's not going to reflect you as a person per se. Now, that gets into difficult topic of personhood, which is for a future series.